Welcome to the off-season edition of USFL Today. We're your hosts, Angelo Fioris and Luke Miller, coming at you. You might call this, Luke, an emergency edition of USFL Today, huh?
Yeah, it is. I mean, so emergency that you took a break out of your European vacation to hop on here. You had enough foresight to bring your mic with you and be prepared in case news like this dropped while you were away. But I think we certainly weren't planning on it.
No, certainly not. As a matter of fact, just like 2 days ago, I said to Vonda, I don't think I'm doing a show while we're here. And then all of a sudden, here we are, Luke. The big news, of course, USFL and XFL rumored or maybe close to being confirmed that they are in the talks to possibly merge. There's been enough chatter about it for me to get the sense that this is probably real.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important that we be upfront and honest about what we know and what we don't know. What we don't know is a lot more than what we do know. But what we do know is that there are multiple very credible uh, outlets publishing reports with multiple sources
Right.
that the USFL and XFL are in serious talks for them to merge. Now, when would that happen? What would that look like? There's a lot of questions, right?
Yeah.
But I've even talked to some people that have reached out to some inside sources and have indicated that they've been meeting this week, and those talks have been very serious. So I think we certainly are beyond the point of this being speculation. I think we know that this is a very legitimate possibility, but at the same time, obviously, the merger has not yet been completed, right? It's
Yeah.
it's still sort of a live possibility. It's just a very, very real live possibility.
Just the fact that it's a discussion that's happening. Well, I'm going to go on record here and say I was dead wrong. I was very vocal about the fact that I felt that there would never be a merger, that one of these two leagues was going to be gone before 2025 and the other would have the landscape to itself. Apparently, and that's not going to be the case. Looks like they're going to band together and create some sort of a melded entity. Who knows for when? Like you said, details are things we don't know. They don't even know yet. If they're still discussing it, these kinds of things have not been hashed out yet as to what this might look like next season.
Yeah, everything indicates that they are trying, if possible, to make this happen by next season, 2024. But practically, it's hard to imagine how that would work. I mean, I do wonder, this is speculation. This is not something I've heard from anybody on the inside, but I do wonder if maybe it would look something like in 2024, they, maybe bring their seasons together at the same time and kind of operate as separate entities, but try not to compete too much with each other as far as TV windows and things like that. And then they maybe have some kind of like joint playoff, or joint championship at the end. And then maybe in 2025 or 2026 and beyond, it becomes a more sort of integrated one, complete league. But they're clearly trying to do something if possible by this upcoming season. It's just the XFL season, which starts the week after the Super Bowl ends. I mean, that's early February, right? Which
Right around
at
the
this,
corner, man.
yeah. I mean, that's a few months away. I mean, we're
Yeah.
we're sitting in mid-September, so we're talking 4 or 5 months. You've got to pull this thing off. So the USFL, even if this wasn't going to happen, right? The USFL had its own series of questions, right? Of how many hubs were there going to be? Were any markets going to be moved around? All this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and they still had needed to figure that out sooner than later before their season, which doesn't kick off until a couple months after the XFL season. So again, all reports indicate and all sources seem to indicate that they're trying to pull this off by next spring, but practically, it's hard to imagine what exactly that would look like or what would be feasible between now and then.
I kind of ran through those same thoughts in my head as I was trying to process all of this and try to figure out what exactly I would even talk about today in relation to this, Luke. And I was thinking the same thing. My thought was, okay, they want to merge, but they probably won't be able to have a combined league for next year because probably a lot of those individual plans had already been set into place. Plus, they've got TV deals that are sort of already etched out, which dictate what exactly is going to happen for the broadcasting of those games. And with the USFL coming to its third year of its 3-year plan, it makes more sense for them to look a lot different or significantly different in a year 4, let's say, than maybe the XFL, who's only entering their second season next year. But obviously, if they're tying it all together, you wonder, will they treat it like, I think back to how the and I wasn't there, but when the AFL and the NFL merged, they did spend 4 seasons still operating as separate entities, yet not competing with each other for a lot, like you described, to try to drive each other out of business, kind of thing, and then sort of finally came together 4 years later. This wouldn't be a 4-year process between these two leagues because they're pretty new, and there's the ability to shift some things on the fly. But I could see like a 1 year sort of like a limbo period where they both run their seasons and then maybe have a championship game, and then the next year you see a combined league. One of the things I wondered, Luke, and what do you think? I don't know if 16 teams is feasible. I feel like if they join forces, there's going to be some kind of paring down, maybe to 12 or something.
Yeah. So on that front, I've kind of heard different things. On the one hand, All Access Football put out a report. They spoke to the USFL Players Association, and they seem to indicate that there could be the potential for 16 teams. Now, if there are 16 teams, that leaves some questions, right? Number one, for example, what do you do with Houston? Certainly, you don't leave two teams in Houston.
Right.
So one of them gets moved, I assume, but where, right? Now, there's lots of things that could happen with that. You could send the game, shut the Gamblers down, bring the Bandits back. You could leave the Gamblers and move the Roughnecks to a different part of Texas or Oklahoma or something like that, and sort of
Yeah.
keep the branding, but just change the city. I mean, there's lots of things that could happen, but that's a question mark, right? Vegas Vipers is a question mark. They already sort of had the XFL already was in the works of kind of probably moving them to a
Right.
new location, reported probably either Phoenix or Nashville. So, do you go ahead and go through with that? Or as you're kind of indicating, does it make more sense if you've got all these other moving pieces and you're trying to pull off the merge and all that kind of stuff? Do you just sort of maybe put some of those teams on hold, or just maybe publicly what you say is they're on hiatus, sort of like
Yeah.
the USFL did with the
Bandits.
Bandits? But whatever the case may be, whether you shut them down, whether you put them on the back burner, do you sort of hold off on, let's say, teams like Vegas, one of the Houston franchises, maybe one or maybe two of the non-hub USFL
Right.
teams that haven't yet been in an established market? Those are, I think, questions the league has to figure out. It would seem, from what I've kind of heard, it sounds like, this is me reading between the lines a little bit. This
Sure.
isn't somebody told me this, but it seems like the league, if possible, would like to try and pull off 16. And I understand that just in terms of scale. You've already got 16, rosters filled out, coaching
Right.
staffs, personnel departments, all that kind of stuff. So you sort of have the infrastructure there to do it. The challenge is figuring out which markets, where, and the timeline and all that kind of stuff. So is it feasible? Do they maybe, have to kind of shift down to 14 or 12 or something like that? I certainly think that's a possibility, especially if they're going to try and pull the merger off fully by 2024. But, I think 16 is kind of the ideal, the goal. And
Sure.
then is that feasible? I mean, that there's, I think, with all of this merger stuff, the kind of the lingering question for anything is, how feasible is X, Y, or Z going to be?
Right, because if they're going to do something sort of in concert with one another for next season, somebody's got to adjust their schedule,
Yep.
right? And that's number one. So again, it comes back to TV. I believe
Yep.
that someone like an ESPN and a Fox and an NBC have already kind of got some of those plans in place for their post, NFL programming, and what they're going to do with that airtime, including what happens with the USFL and the XFL for their affiliate, and all the other channels that are involved, like USA Network and FS1 and ABC, who shows some XFL games. There's a lot of moving parts involved, which makes me think that like next year they may run separately for their like last year independently, and then have like the plan unveiled as time goes on, as to what's going to happen to the new entity. If they're going to bring this thing together, what I would love to see is an XFL division and a USFL division where they remain sort of intact, where those rivalries that have been established in one league and the other continue on, and then perhaps the schedule adds a layer of interdivisional play, which makes it kind of interesting once this thing is a single melded entity, Luke.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I guess a couple thoughts. I'm glad you brought up the, NFL, AFL situation. I was gonna, get your insights into that as a Jets fan and a football historian. But I do think that's sort of a good comparison where you had these sort of two separate leagues that were competitors, and then at some point they kind of decided, hey, let's eventually merge. And some people probably know, a lot of people probably know this, but not everyone maybe. Like that's how we got the Super Bowl, right? You had the
Right.
NFL and the AFL, sort of the champion of each league, got to play each other, and that was kind of the big game. And eventually the plan was okay. Now after was a third Super Bowl or whatever, like we'll officially
Or,
be kind of
yeah.
one. The fourth will be the NFL officially. But I certainly think something like that is possible. But like you said, the challenge with that is you've got two completely different schedules. So I don't think it makes any sense to say, okay, we'll let things operate per usual. The XFL champion will be crowned, in April or whatever it is,
Yeah.
and then we'll have the USFL champion crowned in the first week of July, and then the second week of July they'll play each other. Like, how are you
That,
going to do that to the
that
XFL
can't
team, right?
happen. That can't, that
That's
can't
not an
happen.
option.
Yeah.
So if you want to have some kind of, here's kind of how I sort of see it, and there's probably more possibilities than this, but in my mind, I think there's essentially kind of three things that could happen. One thing that could happen, which seems unlikely at this point, is you could just say, announce, hey, we're going to merge in 2025 and kind of put it out there and
Right.
say, we're in this together. We're going to operate separately this year. There's not really going to be any overlap this year, but like we're bringing things together. We're not going to compete against each other. We're going to promote each other. Like, and by 2025, this is going to be full go, right? And that gives you plenty of time. That seems very reasonable to me, but it seems like for whatever reason, whether it's money or logistics or whatever, that doesn't seem to be what the leagues want to do. Now, again, they might be forced into doing that, but that doesn't seem like what they want to do. They seem to want to have something in 2024. So if you're going to do something in 2024, I mean, I think there's two options basically, right? Option A, which seems more feasible to me, is kind of like what you were just talking about. Somehow find a season where everybody plays at the same time. Now, again, there's challenges with this because, like
Yeah.
you said, you got to figure out the TV stuff. You don't really want all the games competing with each other. So not only do you have to maybe move some things around from what you originally planned, but you also got to try not step on each other's toes and that sort of thing. But you could maybe do it, right? Either pick the February to April schedule or the April to July schedule, or maybe something in
In
between those two,
between. Right.
and say, okay, this is when all of our teams are going to play. We're going to have, two sort of separate seasons. But then again, at the end of that, we're going to have some kind of either joint championship game or joint playoffs where these teams are going to come together and play. Now, again, that still brings other questions like who's going to televise those games and what rules are you going to use,
Right.
and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that's option A. That seems, again, if you're going to do something in 2024, that seems much more feasible than option B, which would be some kind of full on 2024 merger where you pick one season, you bring all the teams together, like you were kind of, saying you didn't want to see happen. You kind of maybe disband the XFL and USFL as they currently exist. You bring them together with new divisions, new teams. I mean, it's truly one league. And obviously, that's what's going to happen eventually,
Right.
uh, to some extent. But it's just, is that really feasible in 2024? I don't know. I mean, I will credit the USFL. If you remember back in 2022 when things kicked off, it was pretty late into 2021, and we were like still wondering, like there wasn't a lot of news out, right, about like what was going to happen. They threw things together pretty quickly, but
It's
they
true.
also had a much longer time to kind of know this was coming and be planning things and whatnot. It wasn't like
Right.
4 months out from the 2022 season they announced they were going to do this and then threw it all together. So all that to say, out of those kind of three options of 2025, some kind of separate seasons with a joint maybe playoff or championship in 2024, or one full league in 2024, it seems to me that kind of option B of, sort of a joint, kind of playoff championship with sort of an overlapping season between the two seems like the most feasible option. And I think that would be interesting. I mean, like people, there's lots of banter, right? About like, well, I was on record. I tweeted yesterday when this news broke, like, man, XFL teams are shaking at the thought of having to play the Stallions, right?
Right.
So, as someone who follows the Stallions, as someone who's seen them dominate the USFL for the last 2 years and go 21-3 and win back-to-back championships, I'm on record as saying I think that they would clean house against the best in the XFL. Now, maybe I'm wrong about that, right? It's just pure
Right.
speculation. There's really no way to know. But you have a joint championship or a joint playoff. I mean, I think that would drum up a lot of excitement, especially
Sure.
almost more excitement, I think, if they were like separate, and it's like the XFL fans are following their league, the USL fans are following their league, and then like they come together and it's like, our league's better than your league. And, I mean, so I think that could be a good way to do it. But, obviously at the end of the day, all this is driven by money. I mean,
That's
let's
right.
call it what it is. And they're going to do what they think financially, according to their business models and all that makes the most sense. But, you know, that's kind of how I anticipate. Again, those are some of the pathways I anticipate it could play where it could play out, and what I think is most likely. But again, that's all pure speculation.
Yeah, and so is just about all of this, which and
Yes.
touched upon like the next couple of things that I wanted to sort of speculate on, Luke, which is okay, let's start with the fan part. I've always been a USFL guy, right? I mean, I've made that very clear from the start, but I was not the USFL guy who wanted the XFL to fail. I've been the guy who says more jobs for players. That's great. That's what I want to see. I don't have the bandwidth to commit to two leagues. And since the USFL showed up first during this last iteration, that's the one I latched onto. Plus, I've got my USFL, past affiliations. But now it's bringing the fan groups together when this merger eventually happens, and there will still be those lines of support, but as the seasons go on, that becomes blurred, and people start to forget that there was even a sort of that us versus them fan rivalry, unless, and I would, like I said earlier, I'd love them to keep the names like the XFL division, the USFL division, and then have them still be under the same umbrella. And I get why they're trying to get under the same umbrella, Luke. It's to save money because it's very
Yeah.
costly to be, you're competing for such a niche audience anyway, and now there's two choices to get that, to get that product. And we saw what happened to the viewership last year when the ratings started to, when the programming started to overlap between the two leagues.
Yeah. And I mean, let's be honest, like the reason these conversations are happening is I think, like you said, one of two things. I think we all kind of thought one of two things was going to happen. Either one of these leagues was going to crash and burn in the
Right.
next year or two, and then the other league would sort of assume, supremacy and potentially take their teams or property, or just do their own thing and not
Right.
have competition. Or some kind of merger could possibly take place. I don't think anybody necessarily thought that was likely, but if it was going to happen, people thought it would come,
Not this
a few more
quick.
years down the road. Exactly. But I think the reality is after 1 year of competition, and given the history of spring football leagues in America, I mean, let's be honest, like probably what's happened is the executives of these leagues just kind of took off the rose colored glasses and said, hey, if we want to make this thing work, like it's already, the odds are already stacked against you, right?
Right.
To try and do a non NFL professional football league in America. Like it's never worked before, right? And there's lots of instances where it seems like in hindsight, it could have worked if X, Y, and Z went differently, but it never worked. It never has worked. And that tells you how difficult it is to pull this off. Throw a competitor into the mix, right? On top of the NFL competition, college football competition, all the other football competition that exists. And how much more difficult is it going to be? So I think at some point, these executives probably over the past however many months woke up and just said, look, rather than cannibalize each other, let's just sort of raise a white flag. Let's come together and let's figure out what's the best path forward for both of us. And maybe it's joining forces. And, I like you said, like I get that. I didn't necessarily expect it, but I certainly get that. It'll just be interesting to see, where do we go from here? And are they able to pull it off? I mean, we all remember the XFL had these conversations with the CFL, right? And it
Right.
seemed very likely at the time, at least the reports that were coming out, it seemed very probable that there was going to be some kind of partnership, merger, working together between the XFL and the CFL. And that fell through, right? Now, I think this is obviously a different scenario, right? You have two upstart leagues that have only been around for a year or two, not like the CFL that's been around for 100+ years or however
Right.
long. So it's a different kind of ball game. So I do think there's a little bit more, impetus for these leagues to make it work and to come together. And again, from what I'm hearing, it sounds, I would be shocked at this point if it didn't happen in some form or fashion based on what I'm hearing. But to pull in an example from like college football, right? If you followed all the realignment stuff in college football over the past year or two, you
Yeah.
know how quickly these deals can fall apart and how
Yes.
quickly they can come together, right? So it's like, I'm not, until ink hits the paper and there's something published that says like XFL and USFL will be merging, I'm always going to have a little bit in the back of suspicion in the back of my mind that it's actually going to be able to happen. But again, all that being said, all sort of there's again financial and logistical reasons as well as the reporting that make sense of why this is very much at this point it seems probable to take place.
There are hundreds of millions of good reasons for these two to come together, right? And they're green pieces of paper with numbers printed on them. But here's the second part of that now, Luke, right? We talked about sort of the fans coming together. Now we're talking about sort of these leagues coming together. But when they do come together, right? Here's the other thing I'm wondering. Who's going to be running the show? Is it going to be the Fox USFL guys? Is it going to be the Rock Redbird guys? Is it going to be some amalgamation of the two, creating some sort of like a board with a chairman or a commissioner? Like, how's this going to go down? And, what's it going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is like a merger in theory sounds nice and cool and fun and all that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
right? But you start thinking practically about how is this going to work, and it gets really complicated really fast, right? Because as you indicated, the first question is who's running the league, and from everything I've heard, this merger it's not a takeover, right? It's not a pure acquisition where it's the USFL taking over the XFL and the XFL basically being subsumed under the USFL or vice versa. All reports seem to indicate that this is a 50-50 merger. So what does that mean, right? I mean, it must mean that you have some kind of either joint decisions between the two currently established leadership, or you have some completely new leadership, right? That's maybe a mix of the two, or they bring in other people from the outside, or whatever the case may be. But I think those are the things that obviously the leagues are probably trying to iron out as we speak. But it's not just leadership, right? It's also these leagues have such different branding, right?
Correct.
They have such different marketing strategies. They have such different business philosophies up to this point.
Those are the
They've
reasons
got
why I thought a merger wouldn't happen, by the way.
right. I mean, they've got different roster sizes. They've got different rules. They've got a different schedule, as we already talked about.
Different
I mean,
union contracts.
yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously there's a lot in common, right? I mean, they're spring football leagues that play 10-game seasons that have a similar roster pool, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like, yeah, there's a lot of ways in which it makes sense, but there's also just a lot of things that it's like, how are you going to make this work? I mean, even just like this is something, semi-trivial, but like even if you just look at like the jerseys, right? Under Armour had like this whole big thing with, the XFL and Rock, and that was like a big, they did a big jersey promo
Yeah.
on ESPN. And if you look at like an XFL jersey, it's much more minimalistic. It's very modern. It's a very sort of again particular type of, like I said earlier, branding. Whereas if you look at the USFL jerseys, they didn't put as much fanfare into it, right? They took sort of what the old leagues had, kind of tried to update it, modernize it a little bit, but still kind of have more of maybe a classic, type appeal, type
It's
look.
pretty traditional.
Yeah. So imagine like, I don't know, like let's say the Generals, they've got a pretty kind of classic, traditional palette.
Assuming they
Imagine
exist next
them
year.
do what?
Assuming they exist next year.
Yeah, touche. Imagine them, versus like, I don't know, like the neon orange sea dragons or something like that. Like
Yeah, yeah.
it's a weird thought, right? So it's like, and I think if assuming The Rock and Danny Garcia and the people that currently have been involved in the XFL are involved in this new thing, they're going to care a lot about branding, right? So I don't think they're going to do that. But then it's like, well, what do you do? Do you make entirely new uniforms for the whole league? Do you just make new uniforms for half the team? It's just like, it's just, there's so many kind of practical questions that, are raised when you try to do this. And again, it gets back to your original question of like, well, who's going to make the decisions in the first place?
Yeah, because that I think is going to then dictate what the new corporate identity is going to be, right? Because if they take on the personality of the USFL, then they're going to turn off the XFL fans who wanted the XFL. If it takes on the personality of the XFL, it's going to turn off some of the more hardcore USFL people. So now, from a marketing perspective, they're going to have to present an entirely new image, at least from a personality standpoint, right? In addition to some new name, unless it just becomes the XFL and we got a bunch of teams, or it becomes the USFL and we just got a bunch of teams. They're going to have to try to come up with something that's going to satisfy from a marketing standpoint, from a presentation standpoint, from the way they deliver even the way they deliver their news is different, right? So all of that is going to have to change into whatever the new model is going to be. And that's where, like, I start to feel like the weight of trying to pull off and execute this full-blown merger in 6 months or less from now, potentially,
Mhm.
seems a bit daunting, which is why your
Yeah.
original thing from like the beginning of the show, which is, roll it out in pieces while they're still playing a season separately, is probably going to be making the most sense. And I'm thinking of it now purely from a marketing standpoint, because like that's my thing, right? Marketing. And I'm like, wow,
Sure.
what a nightmare this might be to try to throw all this together so quickly, get all the moving parts, get all the people, get all the ideas together, come up with the new plan, come up with the new direction, come up with all the new web entities, because now what do you do with all these websites you got?
Yeah.
So you see how, like, as we start peeling away these layers, Luke, this thing gets more and more complicated and deeper than just, fans on Twitter hollering for a merger.
Yeah. No, I think again, that's the more I've thought about it, the more complicated it gets, right? And just logistically, it's really complicated to think about how are you going to pull this off by 2025 because, or excuse me, 2024, because there's even questions about like, again, and this gets back to they have such different philosophies, right? Like USFL, you've got only 3 teams that were actually in their city last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the XFL really made it a point and really sold the league on the fact that even though all the teams were, practicing
Oh,
in location, they were playing their games in
cities.
their own
Yeah.
stadiums all across the country, right? So it's like, do is the XFL willing to kind of have some sort of hubs like the USFL had? If not, right? Well, is the USFL going to be able to get all their teams in market by 2024, right? So logistically, there's just so many questions if you're going to try and pull this off by 2024. But then even when you get beyond the logistics, like we've been talking about, just the branding, the marketing, right? Like, how does that look? Like, do you have time to pull off essentially an entire rebrand by 2024?
Yeah, that's why I
I mean,
say this is really it's more of a year and a half rollout than it is a 6 month rollout.
yeah, I mean, I just again, I've been, as you said at the beginning, like we've been wrong before.
A
Namely,
lot.
the fact that we didn't
Me.
expect this to be happening, and us having this conversation. But so it's, maybe they know more than I do. I'm not a football executive, and maybe they've got things in place where they could pull this off in 2024 somehow that
Yeah.
I'm not aware of. But
It's possible, I guess.
I just don't see how it you know I'll put it this way.
Yeah.
If they do that, to me, that smells of desperation or something like that more than this is the best decision for both these leagues. Because I just don't see how you can do that well or with excellence in that short of a time frame. Um, and so, to me, it just smells like, well, this is some sort of cost cutting measure. Some let's just get to scale as quickly as possible and just pray that it works out or something like that. I don't know. I mean, maybe that's a cynical way of looking at it, but um, to me, what makes the most sense is you find a time on the calendar that everybody agrees to. You do the work of shifting around the games and the scheduling for 2024 so that it's the least competitive as possible.
Right.
And you put it out there at the beginning. In 2025, we're going to be one big league, but in 2024, we're going to have, the XFL division and the USFL division, and all the teams are going to play their own sort of seasons and their own leagues. And then we're going to have, like I said, either like a joint playoff or a joint
Joint
championship.
championship, probably.
Yeah. And, that's kind of the big selling point. And you put that game, either on Fox or on ABC, and it probably draws, probably at least 2.5, 3 million, you hope. And, uh,
And then
and
we
then you
got
say,
something.
right. And then you say, okay, in 2025, between now and then, we've got a whole year to rebrand, to market, to figure out, what's the next couple of years going to look like? Where do we go from here to, again, release new jerseys, or, whatever
Realignment,
needs to be
whatever it
done.
could be, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Figure out new divisions or conferences if they
Wow.
want to do that. I mean, that seems to make the most sense. But again, I mean, you know, at the same time, I mean, this is not going to sound good to USFL fans, but at the same time, I don't think this is going to happen. This is just I'm just spitballing, some
Right.
scenarios here. USFL, you've only got 3 teams in market, right?
True.
So you could sit around a table and say, look, we've got 8 XFL teams that are in market. You've got 3 USFL teams that are in market. Let's take the 8 XFL teams. Let's take the 3 USFL teams, pick a fourth USFL team, put them in a market. Boom, we've got 12 teams in market. Put those other
On
USFL teams on
hiatus.
hiatus. We could rebrand the USFL teams to make them a little bit more in line with the XFL branding, and either keep the XFL name or keep the USFL name or get a new name. And that's a pretty quick, easy way to get 12 teams in market
For
and
next year.
for next year, and to make it, more aligned than to try and bring all the operations of all 16 teams together under one umbrella by next year. So, I mean, if you're willing to
Great
cut some things,
points.
do what?
Great points by you right
Yeah.
there.
So, I mean, if you're willing to cut some things here and there, there's probably ways to make it happen. But it's just a question of, do you want to, how many USFL fans would you ostracize if you did that, right?
Yeah.
Um, but again, those teams aren't in market, so you could make the argument that, yeah, you're ostracizing maybe some like super fans, but it's not like there's 30,000 people at a New Orleans game that aren't going to have a game to go to anymore,
Right.
right?
And I don't think a guy like, say, for example, Jake that does the Panthers coverage is going to be all that mad if he still gets to go to Panthers games and they're part of this new look league. I mean, why would
Yep.
you be angry if you're a fan of one of the 3 in market USFL teams? You wouldn't be. And then
I
that
mean,
fourth
yeah,
team gets lucky enough as their fans get an opportunity if they are one of the franchises chosen to maybe advance. That's a great theory there in terms of how they could possibly make it work a lot quicker next year. And it makes a lot of sense. Luke, I'm thinking back to when we were in Canton for the championship game just a few months back, and we were talking with Zach and Ref, and all of a sudden the commissioner of the league, the president of the league, shows up, Moose Johnson, and he sits down with Zach and Ref, right? And one of the things he said was that it was going to look different next year, right? But I'm wondering now, as I think back, and I haven't rewatched it, I'm going to at some point in the next few days, but I'm thinking back to his conversation and the kinds of things he was sharing. And he shared a little in terms of like the league had its eye on growth, the league had its eye on satisfying the remaining markets and all of that kind of thing. I wonder if at that time, just a few short months ago, he already knew that this was going to be happening, or did these conversations germinate sometime after July 1st or 2nd when we sat down and watched Moose Johnson share his thoughts with us?
yeah, that's a great question, and it would be certainly it'd be worth going back and kind of trying to read between the lines of what he was
Yeah,
saying.
for sure.
I don't remember anything that he said off the top of my head that put that in my mind. But again, that was also so far out of my mind. He would have had to really made it explicit for me to start thinking about that.
Right.
Um,
Because none of
but I
us
think
came out of that and analyzed it that way.
right, right. I mean, what I've heard is that these conversations kind of started right after the USFL championship.
Mm.
Um, that maybe more will come to light in the days ahead that will show that it was even sooner. But from what I've kind of heard, it sounds like as the XFL kind of waited as the USFL season wrapped up, kind of see how that went, and then right after the USFL championship, you know, again from what I've heard, some people at the XFL with Redbird, that sort of thing, reached out to the USFL and kind of initiated starting having some of these conversations. Um, but you know, they've been pretty tight-lipped about it, obviously, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, and one of the things that I've heard some people point out, which is a good point, is that a lot of the people in these two leagues, not just players, but also or coaches, but also personnel, GMs, league executives,
Sure.
they have a shared history either through the XFL in 2020 or the AAF or just other connections with the NFL or college
Tons,
football
so
or whatever,
many.
right?
Yeah.
So there are people in these worlds that know each other, right? And so you know, I know Mike Mitchell, for example, the way he kind of has told the story is his understanding is that it started with some people more on the football operations kind of personnel side of things started having some of these conversations, and then they kind of worked their way up to executives, and then
Interesting.
executives started sort of meeting and having those, like, sort of like the ideas. Again, is that true or not? I don't know, maybe. Again, what I've heard is more that the XFL, the Redbird side of things, reached out to the USFL. But was there maybe some people that kind of knew each other in the football world that kind of said, "Hey, man, it'd be sweet if we could play each other or bring these leagues together." That sort of initiated that or prompted Redbird to maybe reach out. I mean, I don't think those two stories aren't sort of mutually incompatible.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, all that to say, to go back to your original question, it seems like these conversations have been ongoing. They didn't start this week,
Right. This is
but
the
it also
we
seems
got to be
like
nearing the culmination for this news to
right,
break like this.
right. But it also seems like they weren't serious conversations maybe until both seasons were over. It seems like this has really been something that's been talked about over the last 2 months, basically. But um, like I said earlier, they've been pretty tight-lipped. So, again, if we're going to be honest, we again, like I said earlier, like we know a lot less than we'd like to know.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, that's true. But you know what, though, in all honesty, Luke, I mean, that drop of news which spurred all of this fervor amongst all of us was enough to get these conversations going at a time that, boy, USFL and XFL news was pretty much dead at this point. There was really nothing going on. And I will say this, my contacts, anyone that I kind of talk to in the league that, or, that is in like team offices or whatever, everybody has been pretty mum or quiet. A lot of them were saying, "Oh, there's nothing going on. It's kind of quiet," and others have not even been responding. So, I'm not going to say I had a sense something was coming, but it was just weird that my lines of communication were all sort of on the mum side rather than any sort of information coming through. So, it all makes sense now why everyone's kind of been being quiet, because whoever does know knew, and whoever didn't know just didn't know.
yeah, yeah, and I think it also makes sense why um, you know if these conversations were happening and were gaining steam,
Yeah.
everything else is kind of put on hold, right?
Right.
So there's probably not a lot of conversations about, for example, for the USFL, well, where are we going to
Hubs.
have next year,
Yeah.
or that kind of stuff? Because it's like, well, if you're talking about a merger, that completely changes the game, right? And you've got other decision makers you're bringing in and stuff like that. So it makes sense too that there wouldn't be a lot of news outside of this
Right.
if this has been preoccupying the mind of the leadership for the last month or two. There's nothing really else to talk about, until this is ironed out. Um, so I do think this has been ongoing, but like you said, we're kind of finding out about it at the finish line. What I've heard, again, time will tell if this is true or not. But what I've heard is that it's very likely something will be announced by the end of the week.
That's interesting, Luke, because, one of those other things that I had picked up on in the last, I think maybe late August or very early September, if you remember, I tweeted out about a USFL free agency period beginning October 1st. So,
Yep.
uh, I wonder now if that had anything to do with the timing of some of these possible announcements coming up, because it there's no coincidences in life. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying?
Well, it's also odd because when I remember when you caught wind of that, I was a little taken aback by that because I had always been under the impression, right, that these contracts ran through the end of the calendar year. And
Yeah.
so I thought if there was going to be sort of people being released or a free agency period, that would, for the USFL, that wouldn't hit until January, which again, this is kind of speculating, but like you said, there's no
Sure.
coincidence. That would make more sense to me because you risk, if you release these guys at the end of September, right, going in October, you risk that gives them time to go sign with an XFL
The
team.
other league,
But
right?
you want to kind of keep them in house, keep them on a roster until the end of December, Then they get released. Well, by January, yeah, they could maybe go to an XFL team, but their season's about to start in a month, right? Like that's going to be tough for them
That's
to
a
make
tight
that
window.
jump. But it's enough time for them to land on their feet somewhere else in a USFL team, be ready for USFL camp in March or whenever that starts. And so, yeah, this is again a little hindsight here. Um, maybe it is just a coincidence, but it is interesting that these contracts are sort of set to expire at the end of this month, and we might get merger news by the end of this month, and we might have a 12 to 16 team league by October 1st,
With a
right?
combined free agency period.
Yep, working together.
The last part that I wanted to touch on, Luke, as far as what effect this possible or probable merger would have on the landscape of these leagues is how will that affect guys like you and me and Zach and the ref and any of the XFL gym and people that cover the other league as well out there? How will that affect us in terms of our relationships with the entities, right? Does it change? Like, what if some other new communications person takes over and they don't have the same opinion of what we do versus what the current these are the kinds of things that I'm also wondering about too. Does their philosophy change in terms of how content gets spread regarding their games?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's I think hard to say at this point. I was thinking about this earlier too. The reality is the reason that acquisitions happen, that mergers happen. I mean, there's lots of reasons, but one of the reasons, and that people want to get to scale, right, is again, it's all about money, and it saves money, right? To instead of two separate leagues with two, heads of media relations, you only need one, right? That's one less salary to pay. Multiply that across two decent sized organizations. That's a lot of people that no longer become necessary because you get one person to do what two people were previously doing. So, but that raises the question of, let's say on the in this new merged league, let's say they decide to keep, you know, Daryl Johnston as some kind of,
President,
uh,
commissioner.
yeah, president, right? And but then they decide, well, we're going to keep the XFL media relations, right? Well, it's like for people that were covering the XFL last year, but maybe not covering other leagues, do they have a leg up versus somebody like us, right, who's been covering the USFL so closely? I mean, probably. Like maybe does it really make that much of a difference in the long run?
Matter,
Who
yeah.
knows? But it seems like in the same way on the flip side, right? Like if they were like, well, we're going to keep the XFL brass at the top, but we want for whatever reason we're going to keep these different USFL media relations people and people that have been coordinating in the hubs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean we already have relationships with those people. We know those people, right? So in a sense, that might give us a leg up versus maybe somebody that's exclusively been covering the XFL and doesn't have any connections in the sort of USFL world. So I think the other question too is if you do get one sort of quote unquote super league, right? And you've got ABC, Disney, and Fox both behind them. I mean, the benefit to that, right, is uh you get a lot more maybe joint kind of big
Right.
publicity, right? Maybe people do start taking it more seriously. Maybe eventually the NFL gets involved and takes a stake in this and it becomes kind of a official or unofficial NFL developmental league. But as that happens, right, and as it gets more maybe quote unquote mainstream media attention, does that mean again people like you and I who maybe don't have those kind of platforms get pushed to the side, right? I mean, obviously we'll have an organic kind of connection with fans, and we have sort of the following that we've built through the content that we've put out over the past year. But for a new person who comes into the league, they're not going to search USFL today, like they're going to search USFL ESPN or they're going to search XFL Fox Sports, and that is what it is. I mean, that's just the way things work. But it does, I think, raise some again. It's just another one of those kind of questions that's raised when you take two organizations and create a new one. How is that going to work? And depending on how it works, there's going to be sort of unseen ripple effects that kind of work their way out from there.
Speaking of rebrands, looks like we're going to have to rebrand eventually as this new league reveals its new name at some point and figure out what the hell the new name of this entity and this show is going to be here. Because if there's no longer a USFL, it can't be the USFL today. And we'll just have to see what all that is going to lead to. It
I
would
will say,
Yeah.
I will say something interesting I actually saw just before we sat down to do this. Credit to my friend and colleague Buckham with USFL or United Football Media, I think is the name now,
Sweet.
formerly the USFL Network. He pointed out on Twitter, I saw right before we got on here that there is now an account for at USFL Defenders as well as at USFL Renegades. I
Hey,
haven't had the
wasted time,
time.
huh?
Yeah, I haven't had the time to go and look and see if there's that for every single XFL team or if there's alternatives, like is there at XFL Stallions, or
Right.
um, so that's going to be something I'm going to have to do some digging into and look further on. And there's the question of, was this the league or was this some smart, person out there trying to make a dollar
Right.
who beat them to it? But it does make you wonder, if you were only going to stick with one brand
Yeah.
as sort of the umbrella, right? Again, like you said, maybe you have an XFL, USFL division or something like that. Obviously,
Yeah.
you could create a new name, right?
Sure.
I heard somebody throw around the National Spring Football League. I've heard other
How
things.
uninspiring is that, by the way?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But you know, I do think if you were going to pick one, it seems to me that you would go with the USFL. And the reason I say that, maybe it's just my bias, but the reason I think that is the original USFL, I think, has a much better reputation than the original XFL, right?
Right.
Um, the original XFL obviously is not, it doesn't have a lot of respect for its football product,
Nobody
right?
looks nobody looks back fondly on the
Right,
original XFL.
right. And not only
2020 different story.
right, not only that, but it's like the 2020 and 2023 versions of the XFL really kind of, because of that reality, kind of cut ties with the original XFL, right? I mean,
Right.
they have the XFL name, but beyond that, I mean, different product on the field, different teams. Even when they put teams in the same city, they chose different
Different
names, right?
names. Right.
Right. So it's like, whereas the USFL, you've got the original thing in the 80s that does have a lot of, really great history, Hall of Fame players, incredible coaches, all that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, people know the story of kind of how it collapsed, and that's kind of a sordid story. But you still have, I think, a little bit better football reputation. And then the USFL today, you've got 2 seasons already behind it. It's got the same teams and branding as the original USFL.
Right.
Um, so if you were only going to pick one, it would make sense to me that maybe, and I also think the USFL is a little bit of a safer bet, right? Like USFL as a name makes sense, right? United States Football League. Like
Right.
XFL, nobody knows what the X means,
No one
right?
ever
And
knew.
again, it's had 3 seasons and 3 different brands. Only one of those seasons really, um, you know, I mean, this past season I think was successful. 2020 was probably even more successful, but it didn't even finish the season, obviously because of COVID and
Yeah. Yeah.
they couldn't control that. But
Blame there.
so anyway, all that to say, I mean, I think if you were only going to pick one umbrella brand, I would think the USFL and ESPN, back in the day, I mean, they had a relationship with the original USFL, and did some things with them. So you would think maybe they would be inclined to bring back that history. But I don't know. Again, that's all speculation, right? At the end of the day, if it's a 50-50 merger, they might just say, hey, we don't want to do your thing. You don't want to do our thing. We're going to create a new name, and they maybe find some way to incorporate USFL, XFL into that. Like you said, maybe there's two conferences, the USFL conference, XFL conference, or whatever. But I do think if you were only going to stick with one, I could see maybe why you would stick with USFL, and that makes it intriguing to me that you have these at USFL Defenders, at USFL Renegades accounts. Is there anything to that? Who knows at this point, right? But it's interesting.
Luke, the way that this story picked up steam so quickly yesterday, and because of the fact that it brought both factions of fans together in bewilderment, let's call it, and the fact that this looks like it's coming to a head quicker than we know, we're going to be having another one of these shows real soon, I think, man.
Yeah, yeah. We might need to put it on the calendar for early next week if things go like I'm hearing, or late this week. We might have to have a talk about the US XFL coming in 2024 or whatever.
Or the UXFL or something like that.
Yeah, I saw somebody say if you kind of move the letters around a little bit, you could come up with the Suxfl, the Sucks Football League.
I don't think they're going to do that.
But yeah, that doesn't seem super likely.
Well, Luke, I think we did a good job of covering all the possibilities from a speculative nature. Any or all of this can be wrong, and most likely is because we never really truly see coming what they throw at us. And for that, I'm kind of grateful. Like whatever the next thing comes, let's see. For now, my opinion is um, I'm just going to wait on how the news develops before I sort of commit to how I feel. But my first thought was I didn't like it.
Yeah.
But as we've been talking here, I've become more hopeful for what the possible outcome might be.
Yeah, and I think when I first heard the news, I was obviously shocked. Um, my gut instinct when I first heard the news was not elation. Although I will say I have been a little surprised by how popular this news was. I mean, I put out a poll, it's still live as of recording this, but last I checked, it was like, it wasn't a huge number of people, but out of 150 people or something like that voted in the poll, it was like over 80% said yes, they want this to happen. So I do think both fan bases seem to be sort of coming around to it either immediately or eventually. I think for me, the more I've thought about it, what makes me excited about it,
Yeah,
I'll put it this way. I think I'm cautiously optimistic about it. There's a lot of things about it that make me nervous.
yeah, for
Uh,
sure.
and we've talked about a lot of those, right? But I think what makes me optimistic is if you look at these two leagues, I think if you're going to be honest, they have very different strengths and weaknesses, right? And so, this is maybe, again, this is hopeful, optimistic, some might say naive, but I think best case scenario, if you could take these two leagues, find a way to bring them together that makes sense, and find a way to keep the best of both while using each other to kind of complement each other and sort of, uh, kind of sort of rough out, take the rough edges out, sort of remove the weaknesses of each other. Like, for example, I think when it comes to marketing, the USFL, in my opinion, has done a better job on sort of a national scale,
Sure.
right? As far as commercials, like on the Super Bowl and other big sporting events, TV windows, making sure like they put a TV window right after the Kentucky Derby, right? And we
Right.
saw how that affected the rating. So I think on a national scale, I think the USFL has an edge. On a local, on the ground scale, the XFL, I think, has been better, right? They've done more, obviously, in markets, but not
Right.
only that, they have a stronger, I think, more kind of regular social media presence. They're sort of doing more things in local markets throughout the year. I mean, that's one of my critiques of the USFL. As somebody who, in Birmingham, it's like, I knew about what was going on because I obviously am passionate about this, but like you didn't start seeing billboards and stuff until like a couple weeks out or a month or two out from like the first game. And it's just like
Yeah.
better than nothing, but that's a missed opportunity for a defending champion who's going to be at home again, all the second season for a spring league for the first time in however many, years.
Yeah.
So it's just like, I think you bring those two together, take USFL and Fox's acumen for kind of publicizing this on the national level, take the XFL's kind of marketing department, their social media department, what they've done kind of more on the organic local level. And I think you could have, a really good, robust marketing strategy for this new league. And so all that to say, I mean, I think these two leagues are different. They're similar, but different. They have different strengths and weaknesses. I think it could be a really good thing if it's done well, if it's done rightly for them to come together. But there's so many things that are going to be hard and challenging and difficult to figure out, and so many ways the ball could be dropped. It also makes me nervous, to see what the outcome of this will be. So we'll have to kind of buckle up and see what happens. But count me as cautiously optimistic, I guess.
Well, Luke, I appreciate you as a last minute sort of thing coming on and doing this show today so we can talk about this. I am prepared to be doing another one in the next few days or a week or so with you. No matter where I'm located in the world, I will actually be 5,000 miles away for another a week and a half or so. So I'm here till the 30th of September, and then I'll be back in the US. So we'll see if it's before the end of the month, dude. And will that October 1st free agency period be a two-league affair, or will it be something completely different?
Yeah, and I mean, just to throw one final wrench in things before we
Yeah,
sign off here.
sure.
I mean, the XFL, their plan was to have 90-person training camps, like the NFL does going into this season. So they've been signing people left and right. Whereas the USFL, they were going to have 58 people or whatever it was going into their training camps. And
Yeah.
so uh, there's just again a lot to be worked out if this is going to happen by 2024. And so we'll see. We'll see what goes down in the days and hours ahead.
We didn't solve it tonight, you and me, and hopefully these guys in charge do find a way to get it figured out. But until we know more, that's it for tonight. We'll see you as soon as another announcement comes out. Luke and I will be coordinating to do a show, even if it means me getting up in the middle of the night from 5,000 miles away. I'll do it. I will tell you that I got up at 3:30 in the morning for the first Monday night game to watch Aaron Rodgers tear his Achilles heel, and I'm like, I cannot believe that I
Should
woke
have
up
stayed.
at 3:30
Should have
in the
stayed in
morning to
bed for
watch
that one.
this.
Yeah, should have stayed in bed.
Should have stayed in bed. Like and follow our channel, please, and spread the word about our material. We really enjoy doing this, and we hope you enjoy watching it. We'll see you next time on USFL Today. Luke, take it easy.
You too.